So I've gone the rounds on this fuel system, mounting the tank under the body, mounting it on the frame. After putting the body on and doing a whole lot of measurement and then really looking at the top of the gas tank, it really makes the most sense to hang it on the frame. So that's what I'm going to do now. So with this thought, you can see I am welding in some cross members to support the tank. And my original thought was to drop the tank down on top of these bars, and then I realized, well, then there's no way to get the gas tank out. So I could make the bars removable, but I just ended up deciding weld them in and then go up from underneath with the tank. So what I'll do is I'll bend it back on itself to double up the strength and drill a hole at that mark. I was able to get these straps tightened up, and I went ahead and planned on leaving a gap. I wanted to have plenty of room to be able to really tighten that strap up against the tank. As it is, I could probably even go a little bit tighter, but I want to put a rubber bushing along the edge, and I'll show you that in a minute. But I wanted to go ahead and weld these on. I welded the other two. They were a little bit tight. I had to bend them out a little bit. So now that everything is mounted down, everything's tight, I'll be able to tack these in. I don't want to heat them up too much because I've got nylock nuts and I don't want to get those hot and ruin them. So I'll just tack them into place, take everything off, and then I can paint all these pieces. This is the original Willys Jeepster tank. 14, 15 gallons, I believe this is. This area of the tank for the sending unit, I could actually use a drop-in pump in this area. You can see the size and the bolt pattern lines up really well. And I can also drop a little sump down in here. It's a little tray that holds so many seconds worth of fuel, so you don't starve that pump. I thought seriously about doing that because this is actually an excellent tank. It's just extremely grimy. And then I could cut another hole in it for the sending unit, or just put a whole new hole for the drop-in pump anyways. But 14, 15 gallons is just not going to do it. And as I'm looking at the tail end of this car, there was plenty of space to go with the larger tank. So I started shopping for what tanks were out there that would have a side outlet that I could make work. This tank is for a 48 Chevy. So style-wise, everything about it is just like the 48 Chev, except again, the 48 Chevy only had about a 15-gallon tank. So what they did is they made it taller. They added about an inch or more to it, and it's now an 18-gallon tank. That's about the best scenario I could find to get more gallons and get the size that fit in here. As you'd seen, front to back, it's a perfect fit. Side to side, it even has room to go bigger, but 18 gallons is good enough for this car. Your only alternatives for a Willys Jeepster in an aftermarket tank is plastic. and it's another 14-gallon tank, maybe 15. So you're still very limited. So for somebody that's restoring a Jeepster that wants the correct tank, I'm a little concerned about this being metal on metal vibrating. So I took some hose, regular fuel hose, and I cut a section of it that'll actually mount right here next to the straps. And that'll give it a little bit of a cushion, about 1/4 of an inch thick cushion for it to ride on. It'll be tight in there so it can't come out. I bought all of this from CPP, Classic Performance Parts. The tank, it came with the sending unit and the pump, intake pump. This tank is set up for fuel injection. It has a little tray in there. So the fuel can stay in that tray while all the rest of the fuel is sloshing around. Now, if the tank is always full, no big deal. But when you start getting down low, and if you're going to be doing any course track racing, drag racing, you want to have as least amount of fuel as possible in there, so that tray will hold a few seconds worth as you're launching in a drag race or going through the slaloms. Mine was very confusing. I took a flashlight, looked down inside of there, I can see the tray. There's no inlet into it. So I'm thinking, I've always got to keep this tank half full in order for it to always be feeding into that tray. So I called Tank Sync, who made the tank, just to confirm that either they screwed up or I didn't know what I was doing or didn't know what they did. And there's a drain plug in the bottom of it. That drain plug, it actually has a little trough underneath that drain plug, and where the hole is to the drain plug and where it's spot welded on, there's enough gap there that the fuel can always come up underneath and keep that full. So as it launches, it's not going to move all the fuel out of that tray, and it holds enough for a few seconds, and then it fills itself back up. So if you do get one of these tanks and you're looking inside going, this doesn't make any sense, it does make sense. Mine also has a line going into the bottom of that tray. For the original 48 Chev, you could pull the fuel from that tray from an outside pump. So first thing, you gotta just make sure you got all your plugs and caps off. You want to put your sock on. Try to orient your sock in the way that fits in that tray, so you don't want it to get cocked and pop off. Next thing we want to do is measure the depth. So the shortest distance from the bottom to the top of this edge is 8 1/4. I want to take the bend out of these hoses before I measure and cut. Okay, now that I have these hoses fairly straight, main one is the pump itself. This is just a return line. I'm noticing that they're loose, so that's a good point to make sure you tighten up your fittings. I also noticed the ground is extremely loose, so definitely want to check all of your fittings. Now we'll want to measure the bottom of that flange to the bottom of the filter. I cut the hose off right there. Measure twice, cut once. Okay, now I'll cut off this hose. That hose needs to be a 1/2 inch shorter so that it gets above that filter. There we go. I did forget to put my sleeve on. That sleeve needs to go across here. I'll just pop that filter back off and slide that on. Connect your wires, make sure it's tight, snaps into place. Check the wire connections, make sure they're secure inside the little clips. They did supply some Ziploc ties, so you can wrap this up and zip lock it together. So I have this all set up now to install, and I'm just double checking, triple checking everything. I'm ½ inch away from the bottom on this return tube. One note I'll make, this line, the pressure line, in the instructions, it says if you can't get this clamp to pull that snug and secure, I can't move it. It'll twist that whole tube. So I know it's really secure. The connection on the top of the pump is 5/16, I believe, and the hose is 3/8. So you've got to suck that in 1/16 of an inch. It's thin enough walled and flexible enough, this clamp pulled it in fine. In the event that you couldn't, if this was thicker, which I believe some of them are, you will need to use a piece of this return hose, slide that over the connector, slide it inside of this tube, and then you can clamp it down. But in order to get this over that barb, you'd have to heat it up pretty good to be able to force it down on. But that's what the instructions say, is if you have problems get this clamp to seat well, use a piece of this to sleeve it. Looking at using the rubber gasket that came in the kit, and I'm noticing this wire connector is in the way. So make sure you've got everything out of the way, situated in a way that everything's safe, and you're not going to have any interference with seals. Also want to make sure my wires are not going to contact anything inside. My float is going to be over here, so that's okay to be sticking out. Make sure your filter sock is pointed in the correct direction inside of that tray. You don't want it, in my case, I don't want it over here and having it like this in that tray. Make sure the sock doesn't fall off when you get it down in there. Well, I tightened all these down as tight as I felt they should be, and they just don't feel secure. They just were too easy to back out. So I'm going to use some blue Loctite and lock these down, just to play it safe. Okay, the rubber actually squeezed out a little bit. I could see it as I'm tightening it down, so I know I've got that seated well. Now let's move on to the float mechanism. This kit came with options of sending unit, and I opted for the sending unit for a GM tank, GM sending unit. Why not? Well, the gauge that I'm using has the option of switching to GM as well. So this is a 0 ohm at empty and a 3 ohm at full. So, according to the instructions, first thing we need to do is figure out how deep this is to the top of the gasket. And I am exactly 7 inches deep. Now to the top of the gasket again, we'll measure, this is like 11 inches. So obviously I have to shorten it. And according to the instructions, this should be exactly half the distance to the center of this pivot from the depth. So 7 inches, half of that, I need to be at 3.5. So in order to do that, I don't need to cut this. What I need to do is take it all apart. This slide bracket that is in the center needs to come off, and then I'll adjust everything up to here. What I'll do is I'll start by taking this sending unit apart. We can discard that. tank has a little bit of a taper on the bottom. So as I get up to the center of this hole, I'm about a little less than 7 inches. So I want to go a little less than 3.5. I'm going to go 3 7/16, and that should get me exactly halfway. And then this rod, according to the instructions, at 3.5 inches should go 4 1/4 long to the float, and then you got to make sure that it's not hitting the bottom of the tank. Also want to check how this clocks into position. The holes aren't all exactly spaced for the 5 holes. Okay, so this plate does have a mark on the front of it here for the forward position. The same thing I'm seeing with the gasket. The gasket is notched in the same position, so that's forward. So that is giving me a position of the float being on that side. So with that in mind, I'm seeing that I'm actually shallower on that end. So I'm going to have to adjust this a little bit to make sure this edge where this is falling is about 1/16 of an inch shallower, so I need to adjust for that. So you want to hold this position so that it doesn't get out of sync when you remove the rod. So there's a couple of ways you can measure this length. Measure from the bottom up. That's 7 inches. I can go 7 inches. Or you can actually go by their calculations, and this should be 4.2 inches. I feel a little more comfortable about measuring it this way. So I can double check and look at the dimensions both ways. Looks good. You want to check your movement. Okay, all of that looks good. Now I just need to trim this off. I have this backwards. I want to have that float on this side. So I'm going to scribe a little mark on both sides of this rod. Now that I know my dimensions right, and I'm going to rotate that. As I move this side to side, I can hear it's clear until I lean it just a hair, and I can hear it hitting the bottom. So I think I'm dead on where it needs to be. So I'll double check all the wires and make sure everything's tight, and then we'll put this back in. We're good. My carburetor requires 58 psi of pressure. This has plenty enough pressure to feed my carburetor, which is 400 horsepower maximum, and that 58 pounds of pressure. So this is a good match, but to regulate that pressure, I want to have a regulator on here, and that also came in this kit. And along with the regulator came all of the fittings. They gave me a wide variety of 6AN connectors, elbows, connectors. They also gave me 20 feet of hose. For this stubby little car, that is way more hose than I need, but it is the high pressure hose. The beauty of these fittings is they're just press-on fittings. You don't need any clamps. This is the pressure regulator and filter that came with this kit. It's a GM style, I believe it's Corvette, I think is what I was reading. Press-in fittings and then regular thread on 6 AN fittings. So that's a really nice setup, easy to maintain. Speaking of maintenance, I want to be able to have access to this for any future maintenance. And looking at this area, this works out really well to mount it to the mounting bracket for the tank. There's a hole through the frame right here that's perfectly positioned for this outlet. Okay, so I've got these routed where I want them. I've got good angle to them. I'm not kinking any of the hoses, and I have access to maintain it and still have everything without having to remove the tank. Before I tightened all this down, I had to do some real quick research. Make sure I had this plumbed correctly. This one, the outer one, is to the pump, and this one is marked pump out, and this one is the return line. The center one is the return line. This one's the output. On these two connections, these are 1/4 inch pipe thread on one end, and then the 6 AN thread on the opposite with the tapered bevel. So put pipe tape, Teflon tape on the end of these. I like to use a Permatex fuel resistant sealer myself, and that'll get a good seal. Wiring wise, as you can see, there's a wire for the pump and there's a ground wire. Same thing with the sending unit for the fuel level. Got the level itself and another wire for good ground. You definitely want a really good ground for these. And then the wire comes around. I will put a connector on here, a 2-wire connector that'll go to the main wire harness, and then this one goes around to a ground that also splits out to ground these pieces so you don't have any static. And then the line that goes up to the carburetor, I left it a little bit long here because I'll have to figure out how it's going to connect to the firewall, but it comes up to the fuel injected throttle body. This has 2 lines. One is for the throttle body fuel and the other is a return line if you don't have a regulator.